The Talking Cheeseheads on cheeseheadtalk.com.
Well, Gordon Gee, the president of the Ohio State University, certainly did open his mouth and say some interesting things in the last few weeks. The tape was obtained by the Associated Press, released by Sports Illustrated. Among other things, he talked glowingly about the Catholics at Notre Dame and how they relate unfortunate comments there. He talked a lot about the SEC and their level of, say, intelligence and how that plays out for them. Not the, it's a joke. It's a joke. Funny. It's always fun to make fun of the South, isn't it? It's always fun. But he also said some interesting things that might affect the locals here, and that was in regards to Brent Bielema, I think is how Gordon Gee. If you're going to say something about a guy and imply some things, you might want to get his name right. I like to joke about Bielema's last name, Bielema, because nobody, still, even when he moved to Arkansas, we had people mispronouncing it. Just ridiculous. But his first name has always been Brett. Gordon Gee apparently thinks it's Brent. So here's Gordon Gee talking, and here are the comments that he made earlier, which has caused a little bit of a firestorm nationwide with the bigger comments, but here in Wisconsin with his comments about Brent Bielema.
So we had a tsunami which affected us. We'll be back. Someone was saying to me, well, Brent Bielema leaving that was a blessing for Wisconsin, and they knew it because he was under tremendous pressure. They didn't like him. Barry Alvarez thought he was a thug, and he left just ahead of the sheriff. That's exactly what happened with him. We were at the conference conversations. I actually talked with Barry. He said, well, I didn't talk to him about Bielema. I said, but you could just see that there was a lot of unhappiness. So he did not leave for a necessarily better job. He left ahead of the sheriff.
Okay. Whatever that means, left ahead of I don't know exactly what left ahead of the sheriff means. Does it mean that he left ahead of losing big games and having the program go downhill? I don't know that I believe that. I think Bret Bielema did a good job sustaining regular season success at Wisconsin. But nevertheless, we'll get into that in a minute. Barry Alvarez has to issue a statement after Gordon Gee called him to apologize. Barry basically says in the statement, never did I call Bret Bielema a thug to Gordon Gee or anyone else. Never have I thought that Bret Bielema was a thug. And Gordon Gee's apologized to me. I consider the matter closed. That's fine. But can you see what I'm thinking is, I don't necessarily know always how these statements work. Obviously, it's a PR person with the UW who puts out the statement and consults with Barry. Can you imagine having to write that? I'm thinking Barry must be thinking, oh, God. How? Why? And has to write this thing saying, no, I didn't think the guy that I handpicked was a thug. Okay? Having to put that statement out must have been pretty funny. But nevertheless, thug isn't necessarily the word I would use for Bret Bielema. You want to say condescending? Sure. Yeah. I'm there. Cocky? Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty cocky. But not thug. And there's going to be this storyline over the next year, 2-3 years about comparing, of course, what happens here at Wisconsin with Gary Anderson and what's going on down in Arkansas with Brent Bielema. But I think it's interesting because, the way the comments from Gordon Gee, who clearly is old for one, okay, really old, and, doesn't finish sentences, kind of gets names wrong, implies from conversations with other ADs that somebody's a thug when they never even talked about that person. Okay. But what we get is, the remembrance of how people feel about our coach, Bret Bielema, here in Wisconsin. One, I think 3 main things. One, he never won the big game, right? 3 Rose Bowl losses. He had only 2 bowl wins. He had the big bowl win over, coincidentally enough, Arkansas in his first year after he went 12-1, but really never won a big bowl game after that. Had the tough games in Michigan State, Ohio State, that sort of thing. Off the field stories, rampant, thick in Madison and whereabouts. A lot of stories. I don't even, I can't even give you too many examples except just, bad behavior. And people don't, and the way he treated people seemingly off the field. People didn't like that. Rubbed people in town the wrong way. Okay. And then the way he left. And I think the way he left stunk. I think he did not man up about it whatsoever. And it wasn't very good, and just to me, you should give a little more respect to the person who hired you. And it just wasn't good. It was he kind of weaseled his way out of town. It did not sit well. So there's a big part of me, and I'll admit that wants to see Bielema fail down in Arkansas. And the other part of me is completely indifferent. Okay. But as far as it goes with Gordon Gee, I mean, he's in hot water, essentially insulting Catholics with Notre Dame, insulting the South with the SEC, and making stuff up, as far as Bret Bielema is concerned and Wisconsin. And, who knows where it's going to go. Look, the guy is old, for one, so it's kind of like, well, you're old, we're going to let nature take its course here. And two, he raises a lot of money for Ohio State, right? Millions and millions upon millions of dollars. And that's what's really important, clearly, with all universities, especially Ohio State. So I don't know what's going to happen with it, but the thing that sparks with me with this whole thing is I'm curious to see where the legacy is going to go of Bret Bielema. Much like Favre and the way it was tarnished, the way he, left and came back with the Vikings and all that stuff. With Bielema, I'm curious to see where it's going to go, and I think a lot of it is going to depend on how Gary Anderson does. Because right now, you'd have to say Bret Bielema is the second best coach in Wisconsin football history. And I know there's a lot of people that would, maybe not a lot, a few people who might argue with me that somebody in, the 50s, the 60s, or maybe the teens was better last century. But I don't think a lot of those people are either watching or listening to this. Okay? So, I mean, you look at the sustained regular season success. Bret Bielema was a better regular season coach than Barry Alvarez when all's said and done, right? Just consistently had very good records. Couldn't win the big game. That's a huge deal in college football, as big as in any sport. So, right now, second best coach in Badger football history. If Gary Anderson comes in and can't keep the program at least at that level, then, I think Bielema's legacy is going to be quite different here in 10 years. I think a lot of people will look back and long for the days of Bret Bielema. When he left, I was saying things like, careful what you wish for. Careful that you're so happy to see this guy on a train out of town. You just never know. And I think Gary Anderson's off to a good start. I like what he's doing. I think he's going to do well. I hope he can compete well in the regular season and in the big games. And it's a bit of a different era now in college football with the scheduling going. But, I think that a lot is left to be determined as far as the legacy of Bret Bielema. I don't think he's ever going to be the best coach in Badger history, but he certainly could improve his standing as history looks back over time. I'll just be fascinated to see that. Or, if Gary Anderson comes in and does really well and wins big games and BCS games or whatever that, gets into the tournament as it approaches here, he'll become the second best coach. And apparently he's much better off the field. So, even better. We are the Talking Cheeseheads, cheeseheadtalk.com. You can check us out on Facebook, like I mentioned, facebook.com/talkingcheeseheads.
The Talking Cheeseheads on cheeseheadtalk.com.